Thank you for downloading from Digital Mindfulness. This is episode number 43. Hello and welcome to the show. My guest this week is Amber Case. Amber is a cyborg anthropologist, user experience designer, author and speaker. Amber focuses on the interaction between humans and computers and how our relationship with information is changing the way that cultures think, act and understand their worlds. She's the author of the book Calm Computing and spoke about the future of the interface for her TED Talk, We're All Cyborgs Now, which has been viewed over 1 million times. I hope you enjoy this show with Amber Case. So Amber, welcome to Digital Mindfulness. Thank you so much for being a part of the show. I've been wanting to have you on for such a long time now, and I'm thrilled we could actually make it happen. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
So I just want to start now from way back, and I'm going to start with your origin story. So Amber, how did you come, I guess, professionally to be focusing so strongly on technology and particularly calm technology?
Sure. Well, I kind of have an allergy to bad user interfaces. And I think I got a lot of that in the idea that the entire world is kind of built by people and that it can be rebuilt. Like you have a choice over your interface. And the reason really where that came from is when I was a kid, my parents were broadcast engineers, so they put television on the air. They didn't want to come home and watch television. So I didn't get a really good understanding of popular culture at a young age. I still don't know who most celebrities are. I don't really understand a lot of these shows. But they did have me watch a bunch of older shows that they grew up with, like lots of James Bond and The Outer Limits. And they also had all these older books. So instead of reading the newest encyclopedia or like understanding culture, I would read this 1960 World Book Encyclopedia. And I remember reading these entries, especially the one on the computer, which was a computer the size of a gymnasium, monitored and managed by like 20 different people. And I looked at that and I said, oh, that's really funny. It's so inaccurate. Like, look at these tiny computers that we have. And I grew up with a computer as if it were a dog, right? So I also had a tape recorder. When that computer died, when it did a slow memory check time after time, that was my first experience of death. It wasn't people, it was a computer. And I mourned it, and I was so sad to watch its memory not work anymore. So when I was growing up, I was thinking about things change, and they change really quickly. So whatever somebody says is the new thing or the old thing, you can kind of use that either to predict the future or understand that you can change that. Like you don't have to be happy with the reality that's there. And also understanding that, the human brain and the computer brain are kind of similar in that when you do memory defragmentation on a computer, that's kind of what your brain is doing when it's asleep at night, when it's going through REM sleep. It's just kind of archiving all your data so that you have more working memory when you wake up and you have a nice clean operating system to work with. People who have sleep apnea don't get this nice renewing process. When my dad found out he had sleep apnea, he had 2 weeks of memory just stuck there. He just remembered, I ate an apple for lunch 2 weeks ago. He hadn't really cleared all that random access memory and compressed all that information. So he couldn't add anything new. It's like, well, what's going on, So I grew up thinking about things this way. Plus, my dad would read me these books called The Evolution of Consciousness, and we'd have debates on Sunday mornings after eating brunch that would last for hours about artificial intelligence. My grandpa made a bunch of artificial intelligence systems and papers at the University of Utah in the 70s, which was the real hot spot for the internet at the time, for the web. It was the fourth node on ARPANET, which was the first internet. It connected the west and the east coasts together on this network. And he also wrote the firing tables for the Mercury Redstone, which was the first successful rocket to make it to space. And so growing up with this and my parents being engineers meant that I thought this was normal, first off. but I didn't really have the normal childhood. There's no way I wouldn't be in tech. And when I went to college, I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do in college? Like, I want to go to MIT, I want to go to Caltech, I want to do more math and science and engineering. I was doing math for fun at home, asking my teachers, can I borrow your college textbooks? I want to check out what you're doing. And then my mom, whose best friend was a math professor, she said, how about you talk to Carmen, and she can tell you about what it was like for her in college. So I called Carmen on the phone, and Carmen said, you know what? You do not need to learn all this math. What you need to do is go to a good liberal arts college and learn how to think, because the world will change. And if you're stuck in some sort of job that just lays you off and you don't understand what you're doing, then you don't have any choice in your life. You don't have any options. And she suggested all these liberal arts schools to go to. So I found one called Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, and they gave me a great scholarship and grant. And I called them up in the middle of the year. I said, I'm sure you have some scholarship money left over, and I could just join in the middle of the year. Like, let's do it. And they said, okay, fly up here, let's do it. So I went there, graduated in 3.5 years. That's kind of what my scholarship allowed. And 5 days into school, I just kind of signed up for a random assortment of classes, like history, communication, sociology, a class called Inventing America, which is all about like inventing the idea of America and where that came from. And I remember the first day of sociology class reading the first chapter of my book. And I said, oh my gosh, this is a way of understanding people? Neat. I really don't understand people. And I signed up with a dual major in anthropology and sociology 5 days into college. And I said, great, now that I've declared it, I can graduate early, I can take all these classes. A little bit later that semester of freshman year, I found this philosophy colloquium, and they were giving free food. So I said, great, I'll go eat some free food. Then one of the people who was scheduled to talk was this person named Deborah Heath. And she had a talk that she was going to give on a field called cyborg anthropology. And I said, oh my gosh, what is that? And she said, come to my talk to find out.
Like that was literally my next question. Like, I saw cyber anthropology on your profile, and I've got to ask her this. What is that?
Right. So here I was being a total nerd about science and technology. I went through an engineering program when I was in high school. I got a job offer at Lockheed Martin, the defense company, and I had read all of these mathematics history books where, the world can change, politics can change, and the people that, understood these things did better. I remember my grandpa and my dad getting government grants, and the more you understand about people and the more you can work with people and understand groups, the better you do. And so I said, oh my gosh, this is great. I'm going to learn about people. And then when I heard cyborg anthropology, it was, oh my gosh, there's a way of blending the two, understanding people and understanding technology, understanding tools in a whole new way. So you have human-computer interaction, which is a way of understanding, where to put buttons on screens, the science behind, making these interfaces. And you have cyborg anthropology, which is quite similar in a way, but it's all about, studying the cyborg, right? And that can be you, right? It's when you interact with a piece of technology, you're a cyborg. We've had extensions of ourselves as tools since the beginning of time. We have hammer as an extension of our fist, and knife as an extension of our teeth. We've had physical extensions of ourselves for a long time, but we've also had these mental extensions of ourselves, cave painting on a wall, and then writing. And these mental extensions have accelerated and they've become unstable. There's even like an institute for the unstable media, which I love, which is really, it's unstable. We don't have our physical interfaces. Like a hammer has been shaped the same way for a couple thousand years. A knife is shaped and looks the same way. We might build it in a slightly different way, but fundamentally it's a knife, and it will be a knife. But our phones, as extensions of our mental selves, are larger on the inside than they are on the outside. We have now we have these technological others that cry, and we have to pick them up and soothe them back to sleep. We have to plug them in at night and feed them. They get hungry. We have to protect them and swaddle them in leather or plastic so that if we drop them, they don't break. We have to take care of them by paying the bill monthly, and we install all these apps. We have this kind of fractal aesthetic on these applications, that all these minute changes. We stand and stare like zombies when we go on the phone. We stop in the middle of the street. We might get run over. They take up our primary attention so that when we drive, we can get in accidents with them. They're pretty incredible devices. So a traditional anthropologist might go to another country and say, ooh, how interesting these people are, how curious their kinships and their tool use are, and their rituals around them. A cyborg anthropologist says, oh my gosh, I'm waking up next to a cell phone in the morning. How does that change my identity, my culture, my history, how I produce my reality, my second self, as Sherry Turkle would call it, online, how I act in different participatory spaces, the idea of a place, and whether that's actually physically in front of me or while I'm in a non-place like an airport, more of a place when I'm on my phone. There's just so many questions that you can ask. How does technology affect culture? How does it affect, the production of ourselves? How do we co-produce ourselves with technology? And fundamentally, the term cyborg came from a paper on space travel in the 1960s that said a cyborg is somebody who adds exogenous components for the purpose of adapting to new ambient spaces, which is the idea of a human is we could go scuba diving one day, we could go to space, next month. And all it is extending ourselves with these physical devices, a little bit of mental training, and we're there. We can adapt all these different new things onto ourselves. That makes us very flexible, externally evolving people. And that kind of warps our sense of norms. We have the new norm of here's a phone with a camera on it. That's a norm now. But 10 years ago, that would have been considered a privacy violation, an enhancing piece of technology. And eyeglasses, they're restoring us to the norm. So that's scary. They're just normal. And they restore us to what is accepted, But when they were first invented, that was considered a strange thing. Now we decorate them. They're a fashion accessory. You could say the same thing about our phones. Now they're a fashion accessory because they're just a normal thing. And so part of cyborg anthropology looks at those norms and what they mean and how technology is usually available for us a long time before we accept it. There's a kind of metabolism rate. And so that kind of leads me into the idea of this calm technology. We have this very interruptive daily life. How do we make technology that doesn't interrupt us and gets us back to being human? How do we amplify the best of humans and the best of technology? How do we let our devices get out of the way and let us live our lives? And how do we work with human social norms in order to make that a reality?
So, Amber, we've been talking a lot about cyborg anthropology, and I'm just wondering if you can go into a little bit more detail about whether you think there are specific ways that different cultures use technology, or whether kind of technology has made the way that we use it more uniform.
Yeah, you see some cultures, say Singapore, that's mobile first. You see other cultures that are not. You see some cultures that are centered around incredible internet access, like South Korea, where becoming a skilled video game player is on par with becoming a lawyer or a doctor. And you can make millions of dollars a year on those things. So there are cultural differences on where people hold their cell phones, how they carry them, what kind of cell phones they adopt. And these used to be much starker differences. For instance, when I first came to Japan in 2009, most people were on the Japanese cell network with Japanese-made phones. Now a lot more people, I've gone there every year since, and I've noticed that more and more iPhones and Androids are the norm on the streets. It's not that network. And as that happens, sites like Yahoo, which on the Japanese phone network on the Japanese phones were more popular than Google, just because of you have this homepage with all these different links that you can easily press. That might go out of favor because we're we're seeing a transition. You also see, I had a friend from Indonesia, and he was on a T9 phone typing incredibly fast. And there, that was kind of like a culture that went onto Twitter a lot, and that worked out really well there. You have, Foursquare and Swarm, being big in places like Turkey. I went to Turkey and I checked in the airport, and there were thousands of people at the airport that were using Foursquare. I was walking around and I would see just people with Foursquare and Swarm on their screens checking in. So it's kind of interesting, like who picks up which technology in which country. Picking up in a lot of countries, the same iPhones, the same Androids. It's kind of converging in a way. I was around the world just in a bunch of different countries and just noticed like how much Instagram is affecting fashion and how there's not really a lot of these differences that you also see in a lot of these places. Like in Thailand, you've got giant air-conditioned malls because hooray, air conditioning, and how many of those brands were actually American and English brands because and people just walking around. I'm like, this looks like America. It's very bizarre, right? So there's this kind of convergence culture, as Henry Jenkins would call it, that's going on where we're getting into this kind of convergence of all these different platforms, and it's becoming the norm in all these different countries. You still have, you have in China, there's a lot of copies of the same types of things that started out in America, and the cultural difference is that copying things is not considered a bad thing as it might be in the West. It's considered, if you copy a thing and do it well, then that's great, right? Which is a little bit strange for some people to consider. You also have things like WeChat that were based originally on an IRC network, so they work really well with low bandwidth conditions. And the way that people communicate in different countries, there's still some stark differences, right? So on WeChat, there's an option where you can just kind of hold down and then you can walkie-talkie talk to somebody. We might see that in the States at some point in the future. But eventually, all of the good pieces from each thing, might end up doing really well. I was in Budapest, and Ubers are everywhere, and they're cheaper than taxis. So it was really strange to show up, use an Uber. And here we go. I'm using Uber for everything. I used underground transportation as well, but it's curious to just see like, okay, well, now that Airbnb is in one country, it can go all over the world, and now it's in Cuba. So how quickly did that happen? And how quickly did that accelerate what people could or could not do in a specific place? Some people say that I just watched a talk at Harvard Law School about Cuba, actually. And one of the people speaking said that Airbnb worked out really well in Cuba because people already let out their houses. It was not really a big deal. And so this was just a more formal way to represent that to people coming in for vacations. And that for a long time you had internet access there, but it was for people outside of town, outside of the city coming in to visit. And now there's kind of the idea that like more people, not just the tourists, should be having good internet. So it's a curious thing to see these technologies and these visitors drive these technologies first, and then have the locals say, "Hey, we want this too." Like, this isn't fair.
Would you say then, Amber, that that in addition to people very quickly adopting these kind of Anglo-American technologies into their lives and using them in their own ways, would you say that people also starting to think a bit more deeply about calm technology and about specifically their relationship to these machines?
Absolutely. For the first part of me flying around and giving talks, I would always start my speech with, "We're all cyborgs," that you don't have to be connected with a machine and have an implant in yourself to be a cyborg. It's not Terminator or RoboCop. Every time you use a piece of technology, you're a cyborg. But I think the other issue, as I went on, is, okay, you're all cyborgs. Now you know that you're waking up next to a cell phone, and the relationship with your technology is if it's a family member. some people are using Alexa like it's a family member at this point. Younger kids are fighting over when to use it. They're cutting off each other's songs and things like that. But I think the main issue is that people get it now, but now they're really stuck on the technology. It's hard to take a moment and relax. Come home, turn on music, and do nothing. It's always, here's a beep, here's another beep. Oh, your house is texting you now. Now it's telling you that, like, the bananas in the fridge are bad. It's like, when a banana is bad. It has a container that will change color. A banana is the calmest technology. We need more of our technology to tell us what's going on in the environment around us and use the least amount of technology possible. And there's a reason why people want mid-century modern furniture. It's very simple and elegant. There's a heat light on the stove that tells you if the surface is hot. When Google Glass came out, there was no light that told you it was recording. That terrified people, that ambiguity. You shouldn't need to click 10 buttons to get your house lights to turn on and off. You shouldn't have to send your information to the network, to the cloud, in order to get your lights to turn on and off. There needs to be a lot more reliance on local networks. So there's a lot where it can go, but I think a lot of people are just overwhelmed right now. They are having trouble paying attention. They're having trouble just getting one thing done. And that's causing more issues with sleep disruption and depression and hypertension and stress, which leads to premature aging, neck problems, for instance. There's just a lot of these kind of health issues that can come about because of that. And the idea that you're not really in reality. You're in what Lisa Reichelt would call continuous partial attention. And you have the kind of email apnea where you hold your breath when you check your email because it's the equivalent of a bunch of creatures in a forest coming up to you and trying to attack you. Everything is just as important as the other thing, and there's too many things to answer. You're not getting your email at 3 p.m. You're not getting your physical mail at 3 p.m. When the post office person comes by. You are getting everything all the time, and you're clicking on things all the time. So I don't think we've created rituals too much yet that allow us that free time where we get reintroduced to the self, or understand that like humans are good at creation and curation, and technology can help us get there. Google understands that, but here's the search results. You have many options, but we're not going to tell you exactly what you want because that's for you to decide as a human.
You talked a little bit earlier, Amber, about primary and secondary attention. And I was wondering if you can just explain to the audience a little bit more about what that is.
Sure. I think of primary, secondary, and tertiary attention as, let's just think about driving a car. Your primary attention is on the road. Your secondary attention is on, you can just glance at the rear view mirror. You can glance at the speedometer and you can understand how fast you're going and if somebody is behind you so that you can make a turn. You also have a clicker so that you can put on your turn signal. And that kind of has this little blinky light plus an audio signal. So you can tell whether it's on or not without even looking. You have your tertiary or secondary, which could be considered the pedals. You don't have to look at those. You can feel them. They use part of your touch response. So you've got sound and touch for the secondary and glancing with indicator mirrors. And your primary is very visual. And you're loading all these variables in your head. How fast is that car going next to me? Can I take a right? Is that light green or red? The calm technology, symbols are the stoplight, right? It's green, you can go. It's red, you don't have to. You can't. Like you shouldn't. And we follow those so much that they've kind of been wired into our heads. We know we automatically put our foot on the gas when it's green, but we also know to look around. So it's not entirely automatic, but it does give us these punctuations. And so if you look at the primary attention scale right in front of you, you have a lot of high-resolution information you can pay attention to. You can get a lot of information there, but as you go further and further away, you get less resolution, but you still get a lot of information. So as you go towards the sides of your head, behind you, you can still hear. You can still understand in your peripheral attention if somebody's in your way. You can use haptics on your feet and hands to understand, what gear are you in? Are you on the clutch? Are you on the gas pedal? And so a lot of designers are treating the world, unfortunately, like it's a desktop, which Mark Weiser from Park Research wrote this great paper that said the world is not a desktop. The original desktop was something you could sit in front of for a couple of hours, pay all of your attention to, not be distracted, and get something done. Now we have somebody trying to download an app or bring up a ticket on a smartphone as they're going through a train station, or whether they're trying to get a coupon in the checkout aisle. They're trying to download something and they're trying to use their boarding pass at an airport. Within moments, with kids yelling at them, with other people trying to do something, it's this struggle of competing attentions. And apps that are, asking you if you want to do a software update on them, which doesn't make any sense because you're in the airport, or you just try to do one task, let's say watch Apple TV, but it says there's a new update available and you need to download it. Why doesn't it, right before you turn off the Apple TV, ask you if you want to download the update, and it will automatically turn off? I mean, there's all these notifications that are not placed at the right space. And so the idea of the world is not a desktop is that we can't pay attention to the world in the same way that we can a desktop. We can't pay attention to our technology that's in our pockets in that same way. But what we can do is make more use of our peripheral attention, of sound, of light, of haptics, so that we don't have to read what's going on. And in doing so, those things will become invisible, like electricity. We don't notice electricity when it's there. We use it all the time. And that's just one of the first, big calm technologies that came out. We have tea kettles that we can set, we can forget, go into another room, and uses our peripheral attention to give us those messages. So what other things can we do in our lives that don't force us to check things constantly? Or have one of those utopic, dystopian future visions where, the San Francisco guy in his apartment, the perfect condo in San Francisco, speaks to Siri, and Siri understands him the first time because he has no accent. The real world is not like that. That forces us to be more computer-like. Technology should amplify the best of humanity and the best of technology.
One of the things that I read recently in an article was that a person from a really huge technology company was saying that technology should be designed to cause more friction in between people, because at the minute, technology is designed to remove friction, to make things as simple as possible, whereas actually he was saying that the technology that tends to be stickier and that, creates better, more human interactions tend to be the technologies that create friction. So, for example, like the car sharing applications, like that's, getting into a car with people that you don't know is not an easy thing for a lot of people, but it forces you to have that discussion. Even things like couch surfing, for example. And I was wondering just what you thought about that, technologies that cause friction. Do you think that there's a place for that, and do you think that actually might be an antidote to some of the things that you've been speaking about? That that might be an antidote, for example, to using more of our peripheral attention.
That's a good question. If we go back to Marc Augé's Anthropology of Supermodernity, he talks about places and non-place. So a place is something where you as a person have an identity, a history, a relation to something. And if you grew up in a small town, you have identity there, you have relation, you have history. And then in converse, a non-place is something where you have none of those. If you walk into an airport, you don't really have an identity. You're a traveler. You don't have a relation to anything, and you don't really have any history in that place unless you've been in that airport all the time. Same with a traffic jam. You might be in the same mental space as everyone else, but you can't talk to them. You're separated. You might be in the suburbs and not know anybody next to you. And now we're in condos and we might not know our neighbors, right? We're in these kind of long cardboard shoeboxes made of concrete. And this is the issue of industrial society split up family groups, put them into different spaces. We're now kind of like global nomads where people are going from place to place and moving and not really settling in. So this concept of place isn't really there in a lot of our lives. We have these kind of non-places. And in order to bring us back together, what we would have had if we grew up in a small town, we'd say, hey, I'm coming to visit. And somebody would have a bed available for you, and you would know them. Industrial society gave us the infinitely traveling businessman, Death of a Salesman, where you're going to some hotel where the place is made to look like no one's ever stayed there before. There's no relation, identity, or history. It's this non-place. It's soul-sucking. It's isolating, and no one feels like they belong. And so you get Emile Durkheim's concept of anomie. Emile Durkheim was a sociologist that did a study on Protestants and Catholics, and noticed that Protestants that were more likely to have this Protestant work ethic and have smaller families were more likely to have anomie, this disassociation from the world. They were more likely to commit suicide than Catholics that had larger family groups and a lot more people around. And so we have these isolating places where a lot of people are single, and that's more profitable to society for them to be single. You have people divorced, you have people having copies of things, and then you don't really feel at home when you're on a trip. So sites like Airbnb come in, and I wouldn't say it's friction. I think it takes the friction out of talking to strangers, because now it's scary to talk to strangers. You walk down the street and you want to guarantee that you feel like you're somewhere, put on a headphones or talk to somebody on the phone. Because then even if they're on the other side of the world, that place, it really feels like a place. It's that music that makes you feel like you're relating to something. It's that phone call that makes you feel like you have an identity and history with that person. We borrow the identity and history and relation of these places into a virtual space, and thus have spaces. And we create them on the go. And that's why it's far more comforting for people to sit there in their condo and order some food to go. Because when they order that food, delivered to them, it's not that, there's a stranger that comes to the door, which is scary for a lot of people, but they don't have to go outside and deal with somebody they don't know. Whereas the preferred version is you live in a place, you get to know everybody and their name, and you become a regular, right? Which is what I try to do. Even in San Francisco, I'll be in the Mission and I'll go to the oldest burrito place and make friends with the guy, and then I'll see him all the time, And so there's this idea of, Airbnb says you have been disassociated from family and community. Here's a way to re-feel like you're someone that lives in a place where, there's some person that's been here, where you have this familiarity instead of this cold, foreign, industrial hotel where you just feel isolated. And there's a movie that just came out called Anomalisa, which is about a guy who frequently speaks around the world. And he is so lonely and so depressed living in these hotels. There's also this Lost in Translation film that most people have seen, which is all about that isolation and anomie of being in a foreign country and having no one around. There's a lot of this, and if you dive into conversations with celebrities, most of their time is spent alone in these hotels. It's far better to have, this Airbnb. And Uber is somebody who can come and pick you up, and maybe you know them a little bit more, or Lyft, where you can have a conversation with them maybe, versus just a taxi driver that's trying to get you from one place to another. So these instead of friction, they're ways of getting us over the friction of being scared to talk to other people, and giving us a better experience. I know a lot of people that will Yelp before they go out to a restaurant. They won't ask somebody at the hotel, what's a good restaurant? And now people are using, Swarm as a way of seeing places that other people they know have liked in order to make sure that they have a good future experience. But I think that's that kind of humanity that wants to creep back in to something that's been dehumanized and isolated, and feeling that way and using these technologies is a way to bring back what was the organically social. I had a really good friend in college from India, and when Facebook came out and we started to use it, she said, "This is so silly, you Americans needing technology to tell you who you're friends with and who you're connected to and who you have in common. In India, we have that for generations back. We don't need that, And you Americans have been so jumbled up that you've forgotten your own history." And I thought it was great.
So, Amber, one of the things that you mentioned very briefly just now was this whole idea of coming back to ourselves. And again, I just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit. And, how do you think that people can come back to themselves in the digital age, especially when there's so much distraction and there's so much for us to pay attention to?
That's a great question. Coming back to ourselves in a digital age is difficult because often we're creating this reflection of ourselves in this secondary space that we think is the primary presentation. If you're familiar with if you're familiar with the concept of a hypersigil, it's this idea that you can create something external to yourself and then use that as a way to become that external thing. And that becomes a feedback loop, a kind of cybernetic feedback loop that produces your identity with you. A lot of people expect me to be online what I am offline. Offline, I'm just this very silly person. Online, I look very professional. And there's that kind of co-creation of now I'm becoming more and more like my online self, thinking more and more about things. And I kind of see this, I like to look at the most extremes when I'm studying something to see how far a thing can go. One of the most extremes is, let's say a 10-year-old creates all these YouTube videos and becomes very famous. And the half-life of that fame is about 6 months. After those 6 months, go back and look at those videos and look at the new videos the kid is producing. Most likely they're having an identity crisis. They have no idea. They peaked too early. They've done this thing, but there's no future for that. What are they going to do? It's this really scary thing. You often have kids from a disadvantaged economic background, and they suddenly got all this fame and some money, and then it's all gone. So there's actually a studio in LA. There's actually a number of them now, and I met one of the people from that studio, and she said, "Yeah, I work with kids age 10 to 14 who come from different backgrounds, and suddenly they've had some accidental fame on the internet, and we bring them in and try to calm them down and work with them both psychologically and financially so that they can set up the proper promotional ties so that they don't just get exploited." So that's kind of the idea of what is our conception of reality. I think it's really important to. It's a really hard thing. I mean, I have an extended persona on the web. That's basically my primary persona. There are some people that say everything that's on their mind on the web, not understanding that there's a larger audience, and they can get in trouble for that. And then there's some people that kind of have a background self and a foreground self. I think of it like Erving Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life, another sociologist who says, at some point you may be a father, so you're putting on the fatherly role, you're putting on the work role, you're putting on the silly role, the romantic role. These are these different places based on context, right? You might be a teacher, you might be a spouse, you might be a child, right? And you act these different ways based on different places. We kind of have the equivalent of the presentation of self in digital life, which is on LinkedIn, you have your professional voice, and on Facebook, you have your silly, very personal voice. On Twitter, you have link sharing. What do you do in these different spaces? And the difference between somebody who can be successful at that and not get in trouble and the person that gets stuck in those spaces is that you have a choice to what aspects of yourself you can present. And part of it is reality production. I share specific moments, and people think that my entire life is those moments, right? They think that I'm always in this perfect utopian reality, right? I don't share the background. I could share the exact opposite, or I could share all the boring moments, So you are considered what you share. You are what you share at this point, which is a kind of odd idea. And so, some people grow up thinking, oh, great, I'm going to share these things and produce this identity. But when they get too stuck in that identity, then that can be a liability. On the other hand, sharing what they really like, let's say like Harry Potter, you can be a professional webmaster and creating an entire community that will last for years. And that can be your entire life's work. You can now become a web cartoonist and make a sizable living. So some people that might not fit into those traditional jobs can make them. But the problem is for every person who makes a living at that, there's a bunch of people who don't make it. And that's kind of the unfortunate reality. There's a lot of displacement, people not knowing what exactly to do, and a lot of these traditional fields not being in reach anymore.
So I'd like to talk about your book now. So you've just published book. Congratulations,
Thank you.
Calm Technology. Um, can you tell us about it? Like, what's the main idea that's kind of going on behind this? Because we talked a little bit about it previously, but yeah, just for the audience who don't know.
Sure. The idea of the book on calm technology is that we have this world that's an interruptive technology, and that separates us from getting our things done and being human. And a lot of our technologies make bad use of our attention. They don't use our peripheral attention. They use all of our visual focus. They take us out of what we're doing and then get us distracted. So how can we make technology? How are some design methods set up so that we can make technology that makes good use of our attention, that doesn't distract us, and lets us get on with our daily life and do the things that we're best at as humans?
So, Amber, you gave us some examples previously of calm technology, but I'm wondering if you can just share with us some companies that are actually doing well in this space and, where we might find them.
Alexa is an interesting one because it sits there quietly until you say Alexa. And it's really good for setting kitchen timers. Like, I think the best example is, okay, I'm making something in the kitchen and my hands are really dirty. I can't go to my phone and set a timer. And I don't want to, oftentimes those timers on the stove are really bad and incorrect. But if you say, Alexa, set a timer for 10 minutes, and it says, timer done, great, right? You don't have to use your hands. So that's a good one. There's the tea kettle, which is the simple one. There is the light, the light on the plane that tells you that the bathroom is occupied or not. It's a pictogram, which means you don't have to translate it into 70 different languages. You just light it up or not, and if you're red-green colorblind, you can still tell whether it's there or not. And I think that these are important things. Another example is the Roomba. The Roomba speaks, but it doesn't use a human language. It uses the Roomba language, which is it goes around, it doesn't try to do something on your behalf. It just stops if it gets stuck. If it cleans correctly, it goes dun 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 dun. It's excited. If it gets stuck, it goes dun dun. And you help it out. And I think that's one of the key points of technology is if it does something for you, it's scary, right? A robot that does everything for you that's out of your control is scary. But if it's kind of a helpless robot and it needs your help, it's like one of those Tamagotchi pocket pets, right? It's this thing you have in your pocket and you have to feed it and you have to help it out, and it's endearing and you love it because you have to take care of it, right? Yeah, the Roomba is taking care of you, but it's also a pretty stupid robot, and it screws up and it's funny. It's so endearing that cats will write on it in YouTube videos. So I think that's another good example. Is like it uses a light, it uses a sound, and it's fun. It doesn't say, Dave, I'm finished vacuuming now. That's gross. A lot of these robots that are human embodied and have human voices started in the film industry because we had all these films about industrial society versus humans. And if it's industry versus man, you have to embody industry in some way. You can't just make it this allegorical message like you would in written text. You have to embody it in some sort of human way. And so that's where you got like Rossum's Robots, and you got Metropolis, where you had like a robot which had a person in it. You had The Wizard of Oz as a political allegory for the time. And you had all these different things. But the issue is, if you're talking to a computer like on Star Trek and it understands you the first time, it's because you can edit that in. You can edit the perfect experience. In reality, in Star Trek, you have Picard say, like, Picard, Alpha 5-3, authentication. And the computer's like, okay, you're authenticated. If I wanted to hack that, I would just put a recording. I would just record his voice when he said it, and then I'd play it back to the computer, and then they'd be like, okay, right? So a lot of that's theatrical, and a lot of how we work in our everyday life, should be simple lights and sounds. Like the red light and the green light at the stop at the intersection. Can you imagine a human voice saying, you're free to go now? No, it's a signal. Signals are better. Smoke is a great indicator. It's a signal for something's going on. It's a fire. I mean, look back to the original things. We had the talking drum in Africa that could represent so many different messages. You had smoke signals. You had light signals, right? Why are we using these really complicated things? We don't need them.
Do you think then? I mean, having written the book now, and you've been saying before that you're kind of speaking a lot about this. Is this concept, do you think, being adopted widely or increasingly by people and by organisations?
I see a lot of people get really excited that there is research on this from the past, and then I've kind of dug it up and presented it to this new generation. A lot of people will fly me out at this point and say, we have this product and it's really hard to use. Can you help us make it easier to use? Which part of it is user experience design, but the other part is styling those indicators so that it's not interruptive. And like with the Apple TV, the product is great. The only issue is that it asks for the software update all the time. How do you move that alert to the end of your playing experience so that it doesn't disrupt someone? So you just watch somebody use the technology and you find the points in which they get angry, and then you move those indicators around until it's normal. And I think that a lot of this new technology's been out for short enough time that we don't remember that people don't want to use technology for technology's sake. They want to get the task done. How do we help them get the task done? And so if good design uses the least amount of steps to get something done, then a calm technology uses the least amount of attention to get the thing done. And so people, you take all the steps away in user experience design. In calm technology, you take away all of the attention steps until you have the least amount to get the job done. So it's kind of this twofold approach. Let's make sure that something is styled correctly. How do you draw attentions, right? So I do not want to have a door that says push and pull on it. It should be obvious from the shape of the door, right? I want to be able to go in from any country and understand what the door says, because it shouldn't have to say anything. The design itself should tell me the message, right? And Don Norman talked about that a lot. That's why we have a door called the Norman door. It tells you. How many doors have you run into that say pull when you should, when it obviously looks like a push door? Right? In Japan, you don't have to worry about that. It's just sliding doors everywhere. They automated their sliding doors. Great. You don't have to worry about holding a door open or closed. You don't have to worry about shutting the door behind you. You don't have to worry about a draft. You don't have to worry about holding the door open for the next person and having that awkwardness. It's just a door and it opens and closes. It's simple.
So you're working on a new book now, hot on the heels after Calm Technology. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Part of it is I would like to produce a book every 1 or 2 years because writing books is hard. I figure, every time I do a thing, like I did the Illustrated Dictionary of Cyborg Anthropology, and then out of that I said, well, this Calm Technology stuff is really exciting. Part of the Calm Technology book was all about sound, and I barely even scratched the surface of what I wanted to get into, and I realized there's a whole book that could be done on sound. Because a lot of these systems use sounds, and the sounds are obnoxious. And we shouldn't be having to deal with all these obnoxious sounds all the time. So how do we make nice sounds? How do we make sounds that indicate more than just one thing? If I get an alert on my phone, and it has the same sound as every other app, it doesn't mean anything anymore. It's just a sound. But if I set the sounds in my system for all sorts of different notifications, like I don't have to set a sound, I just set a buzz. I have a certain buzz if it's a person that I like, my partner. I have another sound for, a general email. I have another sound, and it's just this Morse code that I've created. And I think that Morse code gives you so much more resolution without having to look at a screen. It's that looking at the screen that distracts us. So the book is going to be about that. I'm co-authoring it with a sound designer who has worked in the industry for over 17 years. And one of the biggest things is when you go into an organization, you say, I want to do something with sound. It's really complicated. There's all these terms and you don't know what the sound wave looks like. So introduction to audio theory, and then also how you can apply it to make better objects. And through that, I'll also go through a lot of interviews with nurses and people in the medical field about what does it mean when you have the same alert on all your machines, or these really piercing, obnoxious alerts? Or if you're a nurse and you have a pager that just buzzes all the time, but it doesn't tell you what the buzz means. You have all sorts of malpractice and issues. And I think, at least in the United States, the number 3 cause of death after cancer and heart disease is screw-ups in the medical field. And we can prevent a lot of that by sending the right messages at the right time with the right sounds. If it's really important, it should be a different sound, right? Because as a human, if I am trying to draw attention to you, I will shout at you if it's important, but I don't use it unless absolutely necessary. And I can whisper, I can give you a low, hey, no big deal, but can you do this thing? Which means, do it in the next 5 hours, right? Or urgent, fire, let's go, right? And so these type of messages need to be differentiated, or they just dissolve and we don't notice them. And then we screw up because all these demands are being made on attention. So there's just a lot to be done there. And then a lot of clients had said, like, we want to add sound to our products, or we want to do a better sound experience. Where do we start? And I can point them to like these giant, massive books with lots of equations, or there's not really a lot of good books out there. So this one will probably be longer than the next one, but my co-author's in Berlin, so I'm flying out to Berlin to do a lot of the work there. And yeah, it's coming along nicely. Again, it's all about taking those complex concepts and making it so that you can communicate across different departments. Like, I want a manager to be able to understand it as well as an engineer and a designer. And a lawyer, it needs to be human readable. And that's the problem with a lot of the industries that we have, is they all have these different languages, which are totally necessary for conveying concepts quickly and easily within that group. But we don't have interdisciplinary understanding. And when you're in a company and you're making something new or improving something old, you need to understand why something's important in the fastest possible way, so that the experience is good for people, because people are experiencing the design, the development, the management all at once. But when you're working in a company, you're experiencing one of those at a time. You're often shoved into a particular set of things. You don't get to work across all those things. But products are all of those things at once. They're not, it's just an engineering product, because if it were just engineers making products, we would have the old printers that we used to have before anthropologist Lucy Suchman came in and helped to fix it. We would have rows and rows of buttons and no green copy button. It's the idea that if one type of person makes a thing, we will have to be like that type of person to use it. If an engineer makes a thing and there's no UX designer and there's no manager, we will get a thing that costs a lot of money and is really difficult to use unless you're an engineer. And that's kind of the issue. If we have a user experience designer just do the whole thing, we might have something that's really hard to support because the engineers might take a really long time to understand how to build it, So the idea is, if the engineers know something about the user experience design and vice versa, and people understand audio design, and they can read a quick book to get their feet wet and understand why it's important, then, it'll be easy for everybody. Like, my favorite job was in food service at this burrito shop, because every single day we switched around what we were doing. So if I cleaned the bathroom one day, I understood why I should leave the bathroom in a certain way. Or if I washed the dishes for 4 hours, I could understand why the system was in place. So each of us ended up respecting each other's job more, because as we traded off, we understood like why. If we all did the same job, then we just leave a pile of crappy dishes for the dishwasher, or we'd leave the counter messy for the burrito person to come in. But because we switched around, it really helped. And I think that's the most important thing for companies. You have different people with expertise, but they need to understand what everybody's doing so that they can respect and make things easier. My favorite thing as a user experience designer was finding some of the code and finding some of the processes for the engineers, so that I could create a system with a design pattern that caused them to use the least amount of code and make it the fastest. And they would thank me. They'd be like, okay, good. Thank you so much. And in doing so, I got to work more with them than less with them. It wasn't user experience is something you sprinkle on the top. It was integrated from the beginning with the engineering team based on like what language they like to use and what type of thing they like to stitch together and how the database worked. And if I understood more about that and they understood more about me, we could make a product really fast. In fact, at one of the companies I worked at, we made an iPad, Android, and iPhone app in 3 weeks total, with engineers who had never made any of those applications. And it became one of the top apps in the store, in the Apple store, and Android store, because because we all worked together. And we had a guy remote in Texas, and it was me, and then somebody else, a group of, 4 people? Visual designer, user experience designer, 2 developers. One for Android, one for iPhone and iPad. These were C# developers at a Microsoft company. So there's just these amazing things that you can do once you understand that. Or if a manager understands that you shouldn't redesign an entire thing, that you should call up the support team and ask them what their number one problem is and just solve that, you end up with less support. And you end up with something that people like more. And then your sales cycle becomes faster and you waste less money. And then the support can work on the edgier issues. And then you can involve those. A lot of people say, let's do a complete redesign, which often kills the product because you have to retrain all of the support people. Plus you have to support the existing customers as you transition. And you're going to screw up a bunch of different things and leave some things undone because you forgot about them in the redesign process. And it just makes it hell for everybody. But if you slowly evolve it over time and fix some issues, everything will work out just fine. But it's really hard to convince people of that. Very, very hard.
I hope that your sound engineer parents are going to be involved in your new book.
My dad's excited about it. I hope to visit and talk with him about his perspective on the industry and what needs to happen. He's really interested in kind of an 80 decibel initiative, which is design the sound in the headphones well enough that and produce the music well enough that 80 decibels you can hear everything. You don't have to turn things up in order to improve people's experience and not destroy their hearing at a young age.
Amber, this is my penultimate question, but what do you think is the most important human quality in the digital age, and how do we cultivate that?
I think the most important human quality in the digital age is probably the ability to be resilient and flexible. It's no longer about graduating from high school, having a career, and having that career for the rest of your life until you retire, and having that certainty. It's about dealing with uncertainty, welcoming it, and being okay with it, which is very hard. It's a very childlike mentality. If you have a childlike mentality, which is play with things, understand things at the edges, be excited, be healthy, and run around in a playful way, you can deal with whatever comes up with you. And in doing so, like having a good understanding of history is exceptionally good, because once you get history and like have a taste for it, you'll just understand all of these experiences. I forgot whose quote it was. It was, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Which I love that, because some history repeats itself, but you find these patterns and these rhymes. And once you get a rhyme down, you can understand, oh, that's going to happen in the future here. Also, understanding different cultures is very useful, because some cultures are ahead of your particular culture. And so you can understand like, oh, this is what we'll look like in the future. And this is what we looked like in the past. And you can go back and forth and play and participate in different countries based on that. And I think the other thing is making friends around the world in case you need to, move around. The biggest issue is going to be job instability and random contracting gigs and having to learn new skills. Especially if you're a UX designer or a developer, there's so many new languages coming out, it's really hard to keep up. But if you learn those fundamental principles behind things, then you can be applicable no matter what industry you're in, no matter what the new thing is, because fundamentally it all comes down to the same stuff. How does somebody use a thing? How can you make sure that they can use it? And how do you, and that's a lot. It's really stressful, because it's less like being in a guaranteed spot where you can afford a home and have kids and have one person manage the house and the other person work. It's more about, oh my gosh, like, I don't know what's going to happen in my future, and I don't know how long I'll live, and how am I going to do these things? In the States, people have crippling debt, and they can't do a lot, and it's very uncertain. I'm lucky in that I got a scholarship to school, paid off my student loans within a year, and sold a company. Like, I'm living the American dream, and I'm living a dream that happened before, but it's more of, I'm more like a cheetah that has to go out every day and hunt, or I go hungry. And you might be leaner, you might be healthier, but there's a lot of stress to it. There are a lot of people that will be left behind. There's going to be people who are out of jobs. Trucking is the most popular job in the United States and in other countries. Once trucks get automated, what's going to happen to that? It's like once horse and buggy were automated by a car. We had some heads up as the industry switched, but what happened to those people, right? So it's the idea of, great, I have a temporary job. I'm going to do it for as long as I can. Once I see the industry changing, I need to figure out what the new thing is and go there, or I'll be left behind. Kind of like if you miss your flight, try to be the first one on the next plane and try to understand that, like, you need to book a ticket quickly, so that you don't get stuck. There are spaces that, like, go up, and there are spaces that go down, kind of like these little escalators. So, like, try to figure out a space that goes up. There's a big divergence between upper class and lower class, like we saw in the past. Middle class, I'm not sure what's going to happen there. Middle class is looking more like upper class than it is looking like a middle class. So there are kind of some dangers out there. If you get on the wrong side of the slope, you can just slide all the way down, and climbing is becoming more difficult. Social class isn't really talked about in the States, but, like, in other places, it's a little bit more obvious. The idea of when you're a kid, the stuff that you do for your hobby will likely be your career, not the things that you learned in school, unless you're learning things for fun in your textbooks and reading ahead. But it's, if you're playing in Minecraft all the time and you find yourself building things, well, you'll probably go into engineering, So think about those things. And then the advice that I have for parents is that many of them get really uptight and think that their kid should be exceptional. And they push their kid so hard that their kid doesn't want to be exceptional anymore. Parents should love their kids unconditionally and be totally okay with them not being exceptional. Most of the parents that have kids aren't exceptional anyway. The kid should be exceptional because they're their kid. My parents didn't put any pressure on me at all. They were kind of punks and rebels, and they just wanted me to be happy. They wanted me to skip class every once in a while and get C's, and they didn't pay me for my grades. It was really important because I grew up, my way of rebelling was starting a company, It wasn't, oh, I need to please my parents and get straight A's for them to love me. They're going to love me, and it's going to be fine. And, having that one thing as a stability in my life when the whole world is chaotic and I don't know what's going to happen in the future, you need one thing that's stable. And I think having parents love their kids no matter what and not pressuring them is really, really important. You should look them in the eye, talk to them like an adult, and get excited about the world with them. And if they're curious, help them explore. But don't expect just because they played in the mud for 2 days that they'll be a famous biologist. Allow them to explore their own things. And I think that's really important because kids will be going into careers that parents never experienced before, and allowing them that flexibility and the ability to be dilettantes in lots of different fields will be very useful. It's not about necessarily what you know, but about how quickly you can synthesize something together to make a decision.
Amber, where can people find out more about you and your work?
Sure, I'm at calmtechnology.com and caseorganic.com. And I have a sprawling wiki that's not very well maintained at cyborganthropology.com. But the best way is just to go on Amazon and get the Calm Tech book or the Cyborg Anthropology book. Oh, and Twitter, Case Organic. Anyway, wherever you can just type in Case Organic, you'll find me everywhere on most of the social media platforms.
Brilliant. Amber Case, thank you so much for spending time with us today and sharing your wisdom with us. I'll be putting links to everything we've been speaking about on the show, but thank you once again for spending time with us.
Yeah, thank you. This has been really fun.